The moment that really sealed it for me, the moment I knew something was deeply wrong, was when I heard the radio crackle to life and announce my own disappearance. It was playing the exact details of my life, my name, my job, and how I was last seen on the highway, even though I was sitting in the diner right there, alive and well. That's when it hit me, I wasn't just passing through. The diner wasn't some random roadside stop, it was something much darker, a place that pulled people in and never let them leave. I was already trapped. Now let me start this story from the beginning. Part 1. Title, Just Another Stop. The rain had been relentless for the past 2 hours, turning the highway into a slick, black mirror. Jack Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel, squinting against the blurry glow of his headlights bouncing off the wet asphalt. His back ached from too many miles, and his stomach rumbled in protest. He needed coffee. He needed food. Then he saw it. A neon sign flickered in the distance, cutting through the downpour like a beacon. The Last Stop Diner. Open 24 hours. Jack exhaled, relieved. There was something oddly comforting about diners like this, little roadside relics that smelled like burnt coffee and frying bacon, filled with people who'd been driving just as long as he had. It wasn't much, but it would do. Pulling into the small parking lot, Jack killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening to the drumming of rain against his windshield. The place looked old, but not abandoned. A few cars were parked outside, their windshields fogged up. The neon sign buzzed softly, the S in stopped blinking in and out of existence. Jack grabbed his jacket and made a run for it. A bell jingled as he stepped inside, and warmth immediately wrapped around him, the scent of coffee, grilled meat, and something sweet, like fresh pie. "Welcome to the last stop," a woman called from behind the counter, smiling like she'd been waiting for him. She was in her late 40s, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marlene. "Sit anywhere you like, hon." Jack slid into a booth by the window, shaking off the rain. The place had that classic roadside diner aesthetic, red vinyl booths, checkered floor, chrome-rimmed stools at the counter. A couple of truckers sat in the back, hunched over their plates. A man in a flannel shirt nursed a cup of coffee, staring blankly at nothing. A waitress, different from Marlene, appeared at his side with a pot of coffee. She had auburn hair, tied back in a ponytail, and eyes that were just a little too watchful. "What can I getcha?" she asked, flipping open a notepad. Jack barely glanced at the menu. "Cheeseburger, fries, and coffee." "Good choice," she said, writing it down. Her pen lingered for a second too long, like she was debating something. Then, she gave him a polite smile and walked away. Jack leaned back, listening to the soft murmur of the diner, the hum of the coffee machine, the occasional clatter of dishes, the low mumble of conversation. Outside, the rain poured harder, blurring the world beyond the window. When his food arrived, it was better than he expected, hot, fresh, the kind of meal that settled in your gut like a warm reassurance. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until he took the first bite. Marlene wandered over as he ate, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Rough night?" "Long drive," Jack muttered, wiping his mouth. "This storm's a real bastard." She chuckled. "Storms have a way of bringing folks here." Something about the way she said it made him pause. Jack glanced around. The truckers were still there, talking in low voices. The man in the flannel hadn't moved, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he was holding onto it for dear life. The radio behind the counter played a soft, static-filled tune, warbling between stations. Jack pushed away the weird feeling creeping up his spine. It was just a diner. Just another stop. He finished his meal, left a decent tip, and stretched as he stood. "All right, Marlene. Thanks for the food. Drive safe," she said. Her smile was kind, but there was something in her eyes, something almost sad. Jack shrugged it off. He had miles to go. The bell jingled as he stepped out into the rain, back into the night, completely unaware that he would be walking through that same door again very, very soon. Part 2. Title: Déjà Vu or Something Worse. Jack stood there in the rain for a moment, his chest tight, staring at the diner. The neon sign buzzed, flickering erratically, but the rain had stopped. The world felt strangely still, as if time itself had stopped ticking. He couldn't make sense of it. This wasn't supposed to be possible. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and trudged back to the diner. His boots slapped against the wet pavement, his mind racing. It was just a coincidence. He'd missed a turn, or the GPS had malfunctioned, or the storm had messed with his sense of direction. Nothing more. The bell above the door jingled again as he walked in, a small gust of wind following him as the door slammed shut. Marlene, the waitress, looked up from behind the counter with that same familiar, warm smile. "Back so soon, hon?" she asked, her voice smooth, practiced. Jack nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I guess I missed the turnoff or something. My GPS went haywire." She laughed, the sound pleasant but strangely empty. "That happens around here sometimes. You're not the first to get turned around on this road." He stood there, still trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that lingered just under his skin. He hadn't meant to come back here. And yet, the diner felt as familiar as if he'd been here for years. "I'll sit at the counter," he muttered, walking past her, his boots echoing in the quiet room. Jack slid onto one of the stools, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at his stomach. The man in the flannel was still there, still sipping his coffee and staring blankly ahead. The truckers in the back booth were engaged in low conversation, but Jack couldn't hear their words. Marlene appeared beside him with a cup of coffee, refilling his mug without him even asking. "You sure you're all right, hon?" she asked, her eyes lingering on him with a strange intensity. "You look a little rattled." "I'm fine," he muttered, reaching for the coffee. His hands were trembling slightly, and he cursed himself for it. The radio crackled in the corner, an old, tinny voice breaking through the static. Jack tried to tune it out, but the words were impossible to ignore. "Breaking news, local trucker, Jack Carter, reported missing after last seen on Route 27. Family concerned, authorities searching for clues. No trace of his whereabouts." The words hit Jack like a cold wave. His grip tightened around the coffee cup, almost to the point of cracking it. His name. He didn't understand. He looked around at the other patrons, their eyes glazed and distant, as if they hadn't heard the broadcast at all. "Who the hell is Jack Carter?" The man in the flannel muttered to no one in particular, his eyes fixed on the table. "Isn't that?" Jack's voice faltered. He looked back at the radio, the distorted voice still ringing in his ears. "That's not." Marlene leaned in closer, her expression soft, almost concerned. "You all right, hon? You've been staring at that radio like you've seen a ghost." Jack swallowed, his mind racing. "That broadcast. It said my name. It said I was missing." Marlene's smile never wavered. "Just part of the charm around here," she said, almost too sweetly. "We get all sorts of strange reports. It happens when the storm rolls in. People hear things, see things. Is that supposed to make sense?" Jack snapped, his voice rising before he could stop himself. The words felt hollow, even to him. But Marlene just smiled, taking a step back. "Nothing to worry about, hon, it's just the weather playing tricks on you." Jack turned back to the radio, half expecting the broadcast to change, to hear his name again. But all that came through was static, a low hum that seemed to fill the space around him. "Maybe you should get some rest," Marlene suggested, placing a menu in front of him. "You'll feel better after a good meal. You'll be on your way soon, right?" Jack couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, knocking the coffee cup over in his haste, but it didn't spill. It stayed perfectly upright, its contents completely still. "I'm leaving," he said, more to himself than anyone else. His words felt like a promise, no, a demand. But as he turned toward the door, he noticed something strange. The truckers were looking at him, their faces blank. The man in the flannel had stopped staring into his coffee. Now, he was staring at Jack, his eyes wide and vacant. The entire room was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against his eardrums, suffocating and thick. "Leaving already, hon?" Marlene's voice was like silk, smooth and quiet. Jack turned to look at her, a cold chill running through his spine. "I can't stay here. Something's wrong. Something's." And then, before he could finish, the door slammed open behind him. He whipped around, expecting someone to have entered. But it was just the storm. A heavy gust of wind rushed into the diner, making the bell above the door jingle wildly. Jack's heart skipped a beat when he saw that the parking lot was empty. He had parked there just a moment ago, hadn't he? The trucks, the cars, all of them had vanished. The diner felt somehow darker, quieter. Jack's throat went dry. His mouth felt like cotton, his heart beating loudly in his chest. Something had changed. He turned back toward Marlene, his voice shaking. "Where did they go?" But Marlene just smiled again, a little too wide this time. "They'll be back soon enough, hon, they always come back." And that's when Jack realized, the diner wasn't just a stop on the road. It was something else entirely. A place where the roads, the cars, and the people, didn't leave. Part 3. Title: The Radio Knows My Name. Jack wasn't sure what to make of the conversation, or lack thereof, with Marlene. It wasn't just the weird radio broadcast or the eerie silence of the diner that unsettled him, it was the way the place seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, like the walls themselves were watching, listening. He sat back down, his hands still trembling from the strange encounter. The warmth from the coffee cup had seeped into his bones, but it didn't comfort him. It felt like the diner's air had thickened somehow, as if he had stepped into a world that didn't quite fit. The radio buzzed again. Breaking news report: missing trucker, Jack Carter, last seen on Route 27, still unaccounted for. Authorities still unable to find any trace of. Jack's eyes snapped to the radio, his pulse quickening. His name. It was impossible. This couldn't be happening. He'd just walked into the diner not 15 minutes ago. He'd only been here for an hour or so, and yet somehow, the report made it sound like he was dead. Or worse. The room felt colder. The light from the neon sign outside flickered once more, casting strange shadows against the walls. Jack stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back, but the patrons didn't react. The man in the flannel was still staring into his coffee, unmoving. The truckers didn't even look up. "Why does the radio keep saying my name?" Jack demanded, his voice louder than he intended. He was sure they'd heard him. Marlene didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised by his outburst. She simply leaned over the counter, a calm, almost sad look in her eyes. "Sometimes things get mixed up here. The weather. The roads. It's easy to get turned around. You just have to let it happen." Jack stared at her, trying to make sense of the words. Mixed up? What does that even mean? His mind was spinning in circles, each one getting tighter, more frantic. "I'm not missing. I'm right here. I just drove up the damn road and—" "Relax, hon," she cut him off gently, placing a hand on his arm. "Everything's going to be fine. You're just passing through, like the rest of us." The rest of us. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine, and his eyes darted to the patrons again. They weren't normal people. They weren't anything like the truckers he'd seen at other diners before. They were too still, too quiet, and their eyes didn't hold the same spark of life. It was as if they were frozen in time, waiting for something or someone. He gripped the counter hard. This isn't a coincidence. I'm not just passing through. I can't leave, can I? The radio cut him off again, as if mocking him. Authorities are looking for Jack Carter. Authorities believe he may still be alive, but his whereabouts remain unknown. Search teams are combing Route 27. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His stomach twisted into knots. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Stop saying that. I'm right here." But no one responded. No one except the man in the flannel. He looked up from his coffee, his face blank, his eyes glazed over like he hadn't really seen Jack at all. "Don't ask questions, son," the man muttered, barely audible. "You won't like the answers." His voice was low and ragged, like it hadn't been used in years. Jack stepped back, his heart pounding, eyes darting between the patrons, the walls, the flickering neon outside. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. Before he could say another word, a voice echoed through the diner, a low, static-filled hum. It wasn't the radio this time. It was something else. Something deeper, like the sound of a distant engine rumbling, but it felt wrong. The lights in the diner dimmed. The radio crackled again, only now the broadcast was distorted, broken into pieces, too garbled to understand. But then it came through clear as day, like it was speaking directly to Jack. Jack Carter, missing. Vanished. Gone. The last stop, will never let you leave. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his chest. This couldn't be happening. There was no logical explanation. He felt his body stiffen as the air in the room thickened, growing suffocating, the oppressive weight of something dark settling around him. What does it mean?" Jack whispered hoarsely, his voice shaking. He turned to Marlene, looking for some sort of comfort, some semblance of reason. But she was no longer looking at him. She was staring at the other patrons, her eyes filled with a sadness that Jack couldn't explain. "You'll understand soon enough," she said quietly. "You're not the first to find the diner, Jack. And you won't be the last." Jack's stomach lurched. The last stop. The words hung in the air like a warning. It wasn't just a diner. It wasn't just a place on the road. It was something else, something he couldn't comprehend yet. The sinking feeling in his chest grew heavier, his mind fighting to break free of the tightening grip of panic. But before he could act, the door to the diner opened, and another car pulled into the parking lot. Jack froze. A young couple stepped out, laughing, shaking the rain off their coats. They walked into the diner without a care in the world, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that was about to begin for them. And Jack knew, deep down, that the cycle was starting again. Part 4. Title: They Never Leave. Jack couldn't breathe. The air around him was thick, his chest tight with a fear he couldn't explain. As the young couple entered, laughing and unaware of the suffocating tension in the air, Jack's mind was spinning. He watched them, their faces fresh with life and excitement, completely out of place in a diner that felt more like a tomb with every passing second. The door closed behind them with a soft chime, and the bell above the door echoed through the stillness. The couple, oblivious to the strange weight in the room, approached the counter with bright smiles. The man, tall and lanky, greeted Marlene with a cheer, as though this was just another normal roadside stop. "2 coffees, please," the man said, his voice light, carefree. "It's a hell of a storm out there, huh?" Marlene nodded as she slid behind the counter. "You two look like you've been on the road for a while." "We have," the woman said, glancing at the menu on the wall. "We're just taking the long way home." "Sounds like a good trip," Marlene said with a soft smile, pouring the coffee. But her gaze lingered on the couple, something dark in her eyes for just a moment. Jack caught it, and the chill that crept over him felt like the first signs of a storm, too late to outrun it. Jack's head spun as he watched the couple settle into their booth by the window. He had to know more. He had to understand what was happening. If he didn't, he was going to lose his mind. His legs carried him to the counter before he even realized he was moving. He planted himself on the stool, his hands gripping the edge as he leaned in toward Marlene. "Who are they?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. "Where did they come from?" Marlene didn't look up from the cup she was filling. "They're like you, Jack. Just like you." "Like me?" he repeated, confused. He watched the young couple settle in, talking and laughing like nothing was wrong, like they hadn't just walked into something much darker than they could ever understand. "What the hell does that mean?" Marlene set the cup down, her hand resting on it for a beat longer than necessary. Her smile, when it came, was warm, but there was no real comfort in it. "They'll find out soon enough, just like you did." Jack's eyes flickered back to the couple. The woman was smiling as she stirred her coffee, her hand shaking slightly, the motion almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. The man laughed at something she said, but it was hollow. Empty. And Jack realized then, with a sinking feeling, that they weren't really living. They weren't free, not in the way he had been before all of this started. "They'll never leave," Jack muttered, his voice low. Marlene's eyes met his for the first time, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. She didn't need to say anything. He knew it now, just as he had known from the first moment he stepped inside this place. This diner was not just a stop on the road. It was a trap. Jack's heart began to pound harder, the reality of it sinking in like lead in his stomach. He had to get out of here, but there was no way to escape. He tried, over and over, and each time the road just brought him back. It was like a loop. No matter how far he drove, he was always brought back to the same spot. And the people in the diner, they weren't just waiting to leave. They were waiting for something else entirely. Jack glanced back at the young couple, the man now reaching across the table to take the woman's hand. He thought he saw something flicker in the woman's eyes, something desperate, but it was gone too quickly for him to be sure. "They never leave," he said again, quieter this time, to himself more than anyone else. The door opened again, and the man in the flannel shirt finally stirred. His eyes flickered to the couple, then to Jack, his lips barely moving as he muttered, "Don't talk to them. Don't warn them. You're here now. You can't save them." Jack turned sharply to look at the man, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean?" he demanded, but the man just stared at him, his face blank, unblinking. The man's eyes looked empty, as if all the life had drained out of him long ago. The diner seemed to hold its breath as Jack and the man locked eyes. Finally, the man sighed, a deep, weary sound, and leaned back in his seat, his hands shaking as he clasped them together. "You think you're different?" he asked, his voice raspy. "You're not. We've all tried to leave. Everyone here. We all thought we could just drive away. But you can't outrun it, Jack. No one can." Jack recoiled, the words sinking deep into his bones. The truth was too hard to accept. This was happening. This was real. And no matter what he did, no matter how many times he tried to break free, he would never escape. He was one of them now. As he turned to look at the young couple once more, the air around him grew colder. The clock on the wall above the counter ticked away the seconds, but it felt like time had stopped, stretched impossibly thin. The couple looked over at him, their smiles now gone. The woman's eyes, wide and terrified, met his, and Jack saw it. The same realization he had come to. They were just like him. Trapped. Stuck in this cycle, unable to leave. And then the man in the flannel spoke again, his voice barely audible. "The diner, it takes more than you realize." Jack didn't need to ask what he meant. He already knew. He had always known. No one leaves the last stop diner. Not unless someone else takes their place. And Jack knew, deep down, that sooner or later, he would have to make that choice. Part 5. Title, what's in the kitchen? Jack couldn't take it anymore. Every minute he spent in the diner felt like an eternity. The weight of the place, the way it seemed to trap him, kept pressing down on him, smothering any thoughts of escape. The couple, now staring at their untouched cups of coffee with vacant eyes, only reinforced the feeling that whatever was happening here wasn't a mistake or a glitch. It was real. And Jack was caught in it. He couldn't sit there, playing along with the twisted dance anymore. His mind raced, trying to find any shred of logic that could explain this nightmare. The radio had broadcast his disappearance, the patrons were unnervingly lifeless, and the time felt warped, like it no longer held the meaning it once had. He needed answers. It was the kitchen. Jack had avoided it, knowing that it was the last place he wanted to investigate, but now it felt like his only option. If the diner was hiding a dark secret, it had to be in the heart of the operation, the place that kept the facade of normalcy intact. He slid off the stool, trying to be as quiet as possible, his steps slow and deliberate. The last thing he needed was attention. But as he walked toward the swinging kitchen door, he could feel the eyes of the patrons on his back, even without looking. Their presence was palpable, like invisible strings pulling at him, keeping him tethered to the diner. Marlene was nowhere to be seen, which was the perfect opportunity. The kitchen door creaked open with ease, and Jack slipped inside. The first thing that hit him was the smell, something sour and rank, mixed with the heavy scent of grease and burnt food. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting an eerie, unnatural glow over the space. The kitchen was oddly pristine for a place that had been serving truckers and wanderers for who knows how long. No grease-stained walls, no clutter of dishes or pans. Everything was meticulously arranged, almost like a museum exhibit instead of a working kitchen. Jack's eyes scanned the room. The stove was off, and the counters were clear. But it was the freezer that caught his attention. It was massive, an industrial model, standing at the far end of the kitchen, its door slightly ajar. He could see shadows shifting inside, as if something, or someone, was moving. His heart pounded in his chest, the noise of it drowning out everything else. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, his hand inches from the door. Then, without thinking, he gripped the handle and pulled it open. The freezer was filled with neatly wrapped packages of butcher paper. Jack's breath caught as he pulled one out, his fingers trembling as he peeled back the paper to reveal what was inside. A limb. A human arm. The blood drained from Jack's face as he stumbled backward, his knees buckling beneath him. The limb was cold, but it had an unsettlingly fresh appearance, too fresh, like it hadn't been frozen long enough. His stomach turned violently, and he shoved the package back into the freezer, slamming the door shut. This was no mistake. The diner's secret wasn't just the people trapped here. It was what happened to the ones who never left. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, his mind racing with horror. What was this place? What kind of twisted operation was this? The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind him, and Jack spun around, panic seizing him. But it was just Marlene, standing in the doorway, her eyes unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly, her voice low and almost disappointed. Jack couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his pulse roaring in his ears. He was trapped. He had known it, but now it felt more real than ever. The diner wasn't a stop for food or shelter, it was a holding place for those who had nowhere else to go. Marlene stepped inside the kitchen, her gaze cold. "You've seen it now. The truth." She paused, her expression softening just slightly. "But you still don't understand. No one leaves. Not without a price." Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. A price? What price? He could feel the panic rising again, his chest tightening. What do you mean?" His voice cracked, desperation seeping in. Marlene gave him a sad smile. "You're here for a reason, Jack. Just like the rest of them. You're not the first to stumble in, and you won't be the last. She stepped closer, her movements smooth, almost hypnotic. But now that you know, you have a choice. Just like everyone else before you. Jack's eyes flickered to the freezer, then back to her, his breath shallow. What choice? He managed to rasp out. The same one they all make, she said, her voice lowering into a near whisper. Stay. Or let someone else take your place. Jack felt the words hit him like a blow to the stomach. His eyes darted toward the door, the exit he knew was just a few steps away, but something held him there, something invisible, something stronger than his will to escape. You have to understand, Han, Marlene continued, stepping closer until she was only a few inches away. The diner chooses. And if you try to leave, it'll just bring you back again. The only way out is for someone else to take your spot. Someone new. Just like the couple that just walked in. Jack turned toward the booth where the young couple sat, still oblivious, still laughing. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had to decide. Stay or let them take his place. His heart pounded as he backed away from Marlene, his mind racing, torn between the unbearable truth and the desperate hope of freedom. And somewhere deep in the recesses of his mind, he already knew the answer. Part 6. Title: The Truth About the Diner. Jack couldn't breathe. His chest was tight, his head spinning as Marlene's words echoed in his mind. Stay. Or let someone else take your place. The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders, a suffocating pressure that made it feel like the walls of the diner were closing in around him. His gaze flickered to the couple at the booth, their laughter still ringing in the air, but now it felt hollow, like an insidious warning. They were unaware of the dark truth that had swallowed him whole. They had no idea that the choice they were about to make wasn't theirs to begin with. Jack felt trapped, like a rat in a cage. Every instinct told him to run, to tear through the door and never look back. But the air in the diner was thick, and as much as he fought against it, the oppressive weight of the place held him in place. The thought of leaving, only to return again, gnawed at his mind, turning his stomach. Marlene didn't move as she watched him struggle. Her eyes were cold, calculating, like she was waiting for him to crack, to make a decision. There's no escape, Jack, she said softly, almost like a lullaby. It's always been this way. The diner takes, and it gives. But only for a price. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the words burning in his chest. Why? The question was simple, but the answer eluded him. Why us? Why me? Marlene stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. Because we all come here looking for something. And the diner gives it to us, in exchange for something else. A soul, a life, a piece of who we are. We all think we're passing through, just like you did. But none of us ever really leave. She gestured to the other patrons, their vacant eyes staring back at Jack. The truckers. The man in the flannel. We're all trapped here. We've been trying to find our way out for years, for decades. But there's always a price. Always someone who has to stay behind to keep the balance. Jack's mind reeled. The realization crashed into him, leaving him breathless. They were all like him. All of them had been stuck in this same nightmare, caught in the same twisted game, trying to escape. But there was no escape. Only the endless loop of returning to the diner, over and over again, unless someone else, someone new, took their place. You mean? I'm just another one of you, Jack whispered, his voice shaking. The horror of the truth was too much to bear. I'm not leaving. No, Marlene said, shaking her head. You're different. You're the one who's been chosen. Jack's pulse quickened. His throat tightened. Chosen? Chosen for what? Marlene's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was cruel. Chosen to decide. You're the one who will either join us, or free us. Free yourself. Jack took a step back, his mind racing. The weight of it all was suffocating. How could he choose? How could he let someone else suffer the way he had? And yet, the thought of remaining in this place, forever bound to the diner, was worse than anything he could imagine. I don't understand. How can I free you? How can I get out? His voice cracked, the desperation seeping through his words. You can't leave, Jack, Marlene said, her tone almost soft now, as if she were trying to comfort him. Not without making the ultimate sacrifice. Jack looked at the young couple at the booth again. They were still laughing, still unaware of the gravity of what was happening around them. They didn't see what he saw. They didn't feel the pull of the diner's grip like he did. But they were about to. They were about to face the same decision he had to make. Jack stepped closer to the booth, his heart pounding. He could almost hear the couple's laughter echoing in his ears, mocking him. It was impossible to explain. Impossible to make them understand what they were walking into. He had to make a decision. And deep down, Jack knew the truth. There was no running. There was no escaping the diner. Not for him. Not for anyone. The diner took, and it gave. And Jack knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had become part of the cycle. The choice was clear. But it didn't make it any easier. Marlene's voice broke through his thoughts. It's your turn now, Jack. You know what you have to do. You're either going to let them take your place, or you'll stay with us forever. The diner can't keep them for long. Jack turned back to the counter, his hand trembling as it gripped the edge. What happens if I let them take my place? They'll become one of us. They'll stay. And the cycle will continue. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of it all bearing down on him. He glanced one last time at the young couple, sitting there, laughing in blissful ignorance. They weren't just customers. They were the next ones to make the same choice. And Jack realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was about to become the next keeper of the diner's twisted legacy. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. The choice wasn't easy. It was never meant to be. But Jack knew, with all the certainty in the world, that if he wanted any chance of escaping the diner's grip, he would have to become part of the very thing he hated. He nodded, once. Just a slight motion, barely perceptible. But it was enough. He had made his decision. The diner would keep him. And the couple would take his place. And he would never leave. Part 7. Title, The Offer. Jack couldn't breathe. The words were still echoing in his head, bouncing around in the thick air of the diner. Stay. Or let someone else take your place. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a boulder, suffocating every ounce of his will. Marlene's cold smile still lingered in his mind, and the faces of the other patrons, the lifeless, haunted souls trapped in the diner, seemed to watch him, their eyes silently pleading, waiting for him to make the inevitable choice. He turned back to the young couple, now casually chatting, oblivious to the horror surrounding them. They didn't know the decision that was coming. They didn't know that by sitting in the diner, they had already sealed their fate. They were already part of the cycle. The man, the one who had greeted Marlene with a smile just moments ago, now noticed Jack staring at him. The young man smiled back, a warm, friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze, however, seemed to linger just a bit too long, as if he knew something Jack didn't. Jack felt a shiver crawl down his spine. His hand instinctively clenched into a fist, and he turned away quickly, trying to block out the unsettling feeling that was creeping into his veins. Marlene approached Jack, standing just a few feet away. She didn't say anything at first, just waiting, watching him. Her smile was polite but never fully reached her eyes, just like the others in the diner. Her presence felt like it filled every inch of space around him, pushing against him, urging him to act. I told you, Jack, Marlene said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. You're at the crossroads now. This is the moment that defines everything. The diner won't let you go unless you make a choice. You can stay here with us, forever, or you can leave, but at a price. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He knew what she meant. He could feel it deep in his bones. But the thought of staying, of becoming just another ghost in the diner, was almost too much to bear. Yet leaving, with the couple still unaware of what was coming, didn't feel like an option either. The diner was trapped in an endless loop. The only way to break it was for someone to take his place. Someone fresh. Someone who still had their life to lose. Why do I have to do it? Jack demanded, the frustration rising in his throat. Why me? Why can't it be you? Marlene's face softened just a little. Her eyes glinted, almost sympathetically. Because, Jack, you've been chosen. You came in here, just like everyone else. The diner has a way of calling out to certain people. You came looking for something, whether you knew it or not. And now it's your turn to make the choice. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone has to stay. Someone has to keep the diner alive. If you refuse, the cycle will continue, and more will end up like us. But if you choose to let someone else take your place, you can go. Jack's mind was in turmoil. The weight of the choice bore down on him, crushing him with each passing second. How could he make that decision? How could he force someone else to live this nightmare just so he could escape? As if on cue, the couple at the booth got up, laughing together, their arms around each other. The woman leaned toward her partner and kissed him on the cheek. They were still completely unaware of what was unfolding. They had no idea the diner had already chosen them. Marlene followed Jack's gaze and then turned back to him, a knowing look in her eyes. The diner doesn't give you time to think, Jack. It never has. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not. You can walk out that door, but the road will always bring you back. Or, you can stay. You'll be part of the family. Just like the rest of us. Jack's heart thundered in his chest, the decision pressing on him like an anchor. His thoughts raced, the weight of his options threatening to crush him under its intensity. He looked at the couple again. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just innocent people passing through, looking for shelter from the storm. They didn't deserve this. Do you want to leave, Jack? Marlene asked, her voice low and almost taunting. Do you want to be free? If you do, then give them a seat. Let them take your place, and you'll be gone. But remember, once they sit, once they become part of this, it's not just their fate you're deciding. It's theirs, and yours. Jack's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. His eyes never left the young couple. The choice seemed so clear, yet impossible at the same time. Could he really do it? Could he let them take his place and walk away, free? Or was he going to stay, bound forever to the diner, to the madness? His body felt heavy, like the air around him had thickened even more, pressing down on him with unbearable weight. His mind swirled, the voices in his head clashing together in a cacophony of confusion. Then, a voice inside him, quiet but certain, broke through the noise. If I don't choose them, I'll never escape. I'll never escape. Jack looked back at Marlene. I'm done, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in minutes. I've made my choice. Marlene's smile widened. Then let's make it official, Jack. The couple approached the counter, and for the first time, Jack saw them as more than just innocent bystanders. They were part of the game now, part of the cruel cycle that kept the diner alive. And with that, Jack finally made the choice that would free him. Or so he thought. Part 8. Title, The Cost of Freedom. Jack's heart raced as the couple approached the counter, still laughing and oblivious to the nightmare that was about to unfold. The air in the diner felt thicker now, heavy with the knowledge that he had made his choice. The decision, though gut-wrenching, had been made. But it wasn't just his freedom he had sealed, it was theirs too. He watched them walk up to the counter, the man holding the woman's hand as they exchanged an easy, content smile. Jack wanted to warn them. Wanted to scream at them to turn around, to run far, far away from this place. But something in the pit of his stomach told him they wouldn't listen. They couldn't. They were already part of the cycle, as much as he was. Marlene, ever the caretaker of this twisted haven, greeted them with a smile that was far too welcoming for Jack's liking. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her tone sweet but laced with something Jack couldn't quite place. The man, still holding the woman's hand, beamed at Marlene. "2 coffees, please. And maybe something to eat. It's been a long drive." "Of course," Marlene said, writing down the order as she glanced at Jack with an almost unreadable expression. "Sit anywhere you like." Her eyes shifted to Jack, a knowing look passing between them. The deal was done. Jack couldn't look at them anymore. The guilt was suffocating, burning through him like acid. He turned away, unable to watch the couple settle into their booth, completely unaware that this diner, the last stop diner, had already claimed them. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the door. But as his hand reached the handle, the familiar chill settled in his spine. He couldn't escape. Not really. He had made his choice, and the diner, with all its dark power, wasn't going to let him go so easily. Behind him, the couple chatted idly. He could hear the faint hum of the radio in the background, static crackling before it came to life, eerily familiar. "Missing persons update, Jack Carter, trucker, still unaccounted for. Authorities believe he may have been taken by." The words sent a jolt of panic through his veins. The radio hadn't changed. The broadcast was still playing the same report it had when he'd walked in. It didn't matter that he had just chosen to let the couple take his place. He wasn't free. The diner had its grip on him, and it wasn't letting go. Marlene appeared behind him, her footsteps soft against the floor. "You made the right choice, Jack," she said, her voice almost soothing. "Now you're free." Jack turned, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm free? How? How am I free when I did this to them?" His voice cracked as the weight of his decision crushed him again. Marlene smiled, her gaze unwavering. "You're free, Jack. But the diner always takes a price. We all knew it, the moment we walked in. It's the way it works." She motioned toward the couple. "Now they'll live the life you left behind. They'll become part of the diner's story, just like you did." Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't breathe. He didn't understand. He had given them the chance to escape, but instead, he had doomed them. They didn't know. They didn't understand. "They're not," Jack tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He couldn't finish the sentence. He knew it wasn't their fault. They didn't deserve this fate. But as much as he wished it, there was no going back. The diner had already claimed them. He looked toward the couple, the man and woman laughing, oblivious to their impending doom. The woman looked at him for the briefest moment, her eyes meeting his with a flash of recognition, but it was gone before he could even react. She didn't know who he was or what he had done. She didn't know that he was responsible for what was happening to her. Jack stood frozen for a moment, staring at them, lost in the weight of it all. "Will I ever see them again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, more to himself than to Marlene. Marlene's face softened, but only slightly. "You'll see them again, Jack. In time. The diner keeps them. Just as it kept you." She turned to walk away, but Jack didn't move. His feet were glued to the floor, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He had thought he could outrun the diner, but it had been waiting for him the entire time. The freedom he had hoped for was a lie. A heavy silence settled in the diner, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack's gaze shifted between the couple and the door. He could leave. He could walk away and never return. But he knew the truth now, there was no escaping the last stop diner. Not for him, and not for anyone who had come through its doors. The air grew cold again, the same oppressive weight settling over him. His breath fogged in the stillness as he turned his back on the couple and walked toward the door. "Goodbye," he whispered under his breath, but it was meant for no one. Not really. As Jack pushed open the door and stepped back into the rain-soaked world outside, the sound of the diner's bell seemed louder than ever. He took a step forward, the weight of his decision settling on him like a shadow. The road stretched before him, open and endless, but he knew, he would never leave. He drove away, the same road stretching on ahead of him, the rain slashing against the windshield like a cruel reminder of the cycle he could never break. The radio crackled faintly, and for just a moment, he thought he heard the broadcast again, a new name filling the air. The young couple. The next victims of the diner. And Jack knew, as his truck roared down the highway, that the diner would always find him again. Always. Part 9. Title: The Next Customer. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached, but he didn't care. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath him, the road stretching out into the endless night ahead, but his mind was miles away, trapped in the diner. The last stop diner had claimed him. He could feel it in every inch of his being. He had made the choice. He had allowed the cycle to continue, thinking he'd escape. But the weight of what he had done, what he had allowed, gnawed at him with every passing mile. He had driven away, but it felt wrong. Like he was still tied to the place, bound to it by invisible strings. His breath was shallow, his thoughts jumbled. The storm had died down, but the unsettling feeling never left. The endless road, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement, felt like a mockery of freedom. The diner had given him a false hope, a fleeting moment of peace, but in truth, he wasn't free. He would never be. The radio crackled to life with an eerie burst of static, jolting Jack's thoughts to the present. He barely even flinched anymore. He knew what was coming. He had heard it too many times. Breaking news: the couple, Sarah and Ben Williams, last seen entering the last stop diner on Route 27, reported missing. The voice seemed to echo in the cab, bouncing around his skull, louder than it had been in the diner itself. Jack's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Authorities believe the couple may have vanished into the mysterious disappearance zone along the highway. The words blurred together. Jack's stomach twisted violently. It was happening. He had thought, foolishly, that his decision had been a way out, an escape. But now, the diner's curse was more real than ever. The couple was already gone, already lost to the diner. He had sent them to their doom. Jack slammed his fist against the dashboard, the echo of the impact vibrating through the truck. His heart thudded heavily in his chest. The guilt was suffocating. He had chosen their fate, just as he had chosen his own. But it wasn't enough to let him go. There was no getting free. The radio went silent, and Jack's pulse raced as he tried to focus on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread curling in his gut. But then, just as quickly as it had cut out, the radio crackled again. Only this time, it was different. The static was louder, sharper. The diner always needs one more. One more to keep it going. The last stop, the next customer. Jack's hands trembled as he adjusted the volume, trying to block out the haunting message. But it was too late. The words had already carved themselves into his mind, and now they echoed louder than the hum of the engine. He looked out the windshield, his eyes searching the empty road ahead, but something caught his eye. A figure. Just ahead, on the shoulder of the road, a small, beat-up car was parked, the headlights dim in the distance. It was barely visible through the mist and fog, but the figure was there, someone standing, waiting. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't be sure, but the figure looked familiar. A man, his face obscured by the rain-soaked night, standing beside the car, unmoving. The world seemed to slow around Jack, every muscle in his body tensing in fear. He had to pass. He had to keep driving. But something inside him screamed to stop, to pull over and check. What if this person was just like him? What if he, too, was looking for the diner, trapped like the rest of them? The truck's tires screeched as Jack hit the brakes, the truck fishtailing on the slick road. His stomach dropped as he swerved to the side, stopping a few feet away from the figure. The rain lashed against the windshield, and the man's face was still hidden in the darkness. But Jack could see his hand raised slightly, just enough to signal. Jack's mind screamed at him to drive away, to never look back. He knew this was a trap. He knew what was happening. But his body didn't listen. It couldn't. He swung open the door and stepped out into the cold night air, his boots sloshing through the wet earth. The man was still standing, as if frozen in place, waiting. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared at Jack with those empty, lifeless eyes that seemed to reflect the hopelessness Jack felt in his own soul. "Are you okay?" Jack managed to croak, his voice hoarse. The man's lips barely moved, but his voice was clear. "I'm looking for the last stop diner." Jack's blood ran cold. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and the reality of it hit him like a freight train. He hadn't escaped. The diner wasn't finished with him. It never would be. The man looked at Jack, his eyes empty, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm lost, just like you." Jack's chest tightened. His throat closed up, and his legs felt weak beneath him. He had been through this before, he knew what came next. He was the next person to pass through the diner's doors. He had already made his choice. The man took a slow step forward, and Jack took a step back, but he knew it didn't matter. The diner would take them both. It always did. "Get in the truck," Jack said, his voice flat. There was no other choice. There never was. As the man climbed into the cab, Jack slammed the door shut. He looked out the windshield, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. The road stretched ahead, endless, and the diner was waiting. He could feel its pull, even now, even here, even in the middle of nowhere. And as he shifted the truck into gear and drove forward, the faint glow of the diner appeared in the distance, growing larger, pulling them in. The cycle was starting again. And Jack knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he would never escape. The diner had claimed him. And it was already waiting for the next customer. Part 10. Title: The Next Customer. The road stretched endlessly before Jack, his headlights casting eerie beams through the rain-soaked night. The engine hummed, a dull, monotonous sound that only seemed to emphasize the oppressive silence between him and the man in the passenger seat. His name still rang in Jack's mind, though it didn't matter anymore. He was just another piece in the same sick game. The man beside him had barely spoken since climbing into the cab, his face hidden in the shadows. But Jack could feel the weight of his presence, as if the man's very existence was another chain around his wrist, pulling him back into the diner's grasp. For the 100th time, Jack glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the familiar flicker of neon lights in the distance. But the road remained empty, stretching out into the night without end. It didn't matter how far he drove. It didn't matter how fast he went. The diner was waiting, hidden just beyond the horizon, waiting to claim its next victim. He could feel it now. The pull. The diner's grip on him, tightening again, stronger than ever. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the road ahead. But it was useless. The diner wasn't just a place, it was an inevitability. A dark thought tugged at his mind. If he let the man stay with him, would he, too, become part of the diner's twisted family? Would the cycle start over again, endlessly repeating itself? Or was Jack simply delaying the inevitable, delaying his own fate just a little longer? The truck rumbled down the road, but Jack could see it now. A faint, red glow cutting through the mist ahead. The diner's neon sign flickered into view like a lighthouse in the storm. The last stop diner. It wasn't far now. Jack could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a deep, gnawing sensation that had only intensified since the man had gotten into the truck. The man hadn't asked where they were going. He didn't need to. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he sped up. The diner was growing larger with every passing second. The rain was heavier now, hammering against the windshield, but Jack barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the glowing sign, his mind already caught in the pull. The man turned to look at Jack. There was a coldness in his eyes, the same emptiness that had consumed Jack. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The diner was inevitable. Jack felt his pulse quicken as they approached the parking lot, the familiar sights growing more real by the second. The sign flickered again, casting a pale red glow across the pavement. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned him in. It was no longer a choice. The road had led him here, and the diner had claimed him. It had claimed all of them. The truck came to a stop. The engine idled for a moment, and then the man opened the door and stepped out. Jack couldn't move. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the knowledge that he was trapped. He wasn't just driving. He was going in circles, chasing the same destination over and over again. The diner was never far behind. The man didn't look back as he walked toward the door. Jack watched him go, his stomach sinking deeper with every step. Inside, Jack knew the cycle would continue. The man would sit down, just like everyone else had before him. He would meet the same fate. He would become part of the diner's twisted world, just as Jack had. And the next person, the next unsuspecting traveler, would walk in, just like Jack had. The next customer. Jack closed his eyes, leaning his head against the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, the diner pulling him in, pulling them all in. The diner didn't stop. It never stopped. It had a place for everyone. And once you entered, you could never leave. The bell above the diner door rang as it swung open, and Jack opened his eyes. For the first time, he knew the truth. He hadn't been the first. And he wouldn't be the last. The diner had claimed him. Just as it would claim anyone else who wandered in. And it would never stop. It would never end. Jack turned the key in the ignition and drove forward, the headlights casting a final, lingering glance at the man entering the diner. His truck rumbled down the road, the familiar red glow of the diner fading into the night behind him. The cycle had started again. The diner was waiting for the next customer. And Jack would never escape. He knew that now. The road stretched out before him, endless, like the years that would pass before the diner claimed its next soul. And Jack would be there to watch. Because he was part of it now. Part of the cycle. Forever. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Also, leave your comments and criticisms on this video.